So our next speaker of the evening is Peter James Hudson. Peter is Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at UCLA. His research interests are in the history of capitalism, white supremacy, and US imperialism, the intellectual and political economy history of the Caribbean and the Black world, and the history of Black radicalism and global anti-imperialism. He's the author of the amazing book, Bankers and Empire, How Wall Street Colonized the Caribbean. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this afternoon's panel. Good evening or good afternoon to everyone there. I should add one thing to my bio. I'm also a proud member of the Black Alliance for Peace and work very closely with the Haiti Americas team. And I'd also like to give a very special shout out to the great Barbara Binns in Vancouver, who I've seen in the chat. It's Black History Month, and I've been asked to talk about the history of Canada's banking and financial institutions in the Caribbean. I'd like to approach that history in a slightly roundabout and counterintuitive fashion by beginning with the novelist, with the late Bayesian novelist, George Lamming. Now, in November 1961, George Lamming published an essay in the Canadian magazine Maclean's, the magazine that I'm sure most of you, at least most of you north of the border, are familiar with. The article was titled, "The West Indians, Our Loneliest Immigrants." It recounts Lamming's visit to Canada to not only document the lives of West Indian immigrants, but to simply find West Indian immigrants. And in 1961, Lamming did not find that many. Lamming described Toronto as utterly white, and he'd had to travel to Forest Hills kitchens and church basements in Montreal to find West Indian people. Citing literature from the Canadian Department of Immigration, Lamming discovered that in 1959, precisely 280 West Indians had immigrated to Canada, the majority to Toronto, with a handful to Vancouver, Ottawa, Montreal, Quebec, and Winnipeg. All of them were women employed as domestic labor, and they were largely separated from each other, dispersed across the 4,000-mile wide geography of the Dominion. Lamming found a small, fragmented, dispersed population confronted by racism, but also engulfed with loneliness. That loneliness for Lamming was not merely personal, but structural. Looking at the numbers and looking at the dispersal of Caribbean people across the country, with no one place developing a critical mass, Lamming wondered if Canadian immigration policy towards Black people was determined in part by what he described as a technique of separation. This technique of separation, Lamming suspected, was a deliberate attempt by the Canadian government to prevent Black people from congregating en masse and organizing en masse. Of course, since the time of Lamming's visit to Canada, the numbers of Black people has increased dramatically. But I want to argue that that technique of separation remains for understanding Canada's internal racial dynamics, but also the racial dynamics of its foreign policy in the Caribbean. Which leads me to the question of the history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean. But what, you may be wondering, does George Lamming's Maclean essay have to do with this history? First, I'd like to suggest that Lamming reminds us that any history of banking in the Caribbean is not merely a history of the abstractions of finance, but it is always a history of labor, a history of people. We cannot begin to talk about the history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean without asking how it has affected the life and labor in the region, extended and perpetuated forms of racism and Black dispossession, of Black underdevelopment and exploitation, and contributed to the ongoing issue of Black migration to Canada and elsewhere that has been a hallmark of Caribbean history. Second, Lamming reminds us that we cannot examine that history without turning to those writers, those Caribbean writers, who have gone beyond an analysis that moves beyond questions of class, but beyond critiques of political economy, and beyond histories of a race-free imperialism to understand class, political economy, and imperialism as being bound up with race, racism, and specifically a white supremacy whose effects on Black people have been savage and unrelenting. Thus, before one turns to the banks for a history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean, I ask you to turn to the novelists, the poets, and the writers, to George Lamming, but also to Lillian Allen and Marlene Norbesi Phillips, to Norman Gervan and Erna Brodber, to CLR James and Walter Rodney, to Louise Bennett and Odimumba Kwamdele, and to many, many others. These writers do not always necessarily offer a history of banking per se, but they provide us with the vocabularies, grammars, and narratives to begin to understand how to understand what the history of banking means for Black people in terms of class and race, but also in terms of gender and sexuality. Now, if you want a straightforward history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean, you can go to the RBC website, or the Scotiabank website, or the website of the Bank of Montreal, and they will give you a neat timeline of their endeavors, of their successes, and of their failures. Or you can go to your local library and get their big in-house corporate biographies, books that are full of details of names and places and dates. They are full of useful information, but ultimately unsatisfactory information. The corporate histories will tell you things that we already know, that in part, the origins of institutions like the Bank of Nova Scotia and the Royal Bank of Canada are in the Canadian Maritimes, and they were tied to the trade of salt, cod, sugar, rum, and lumber with the British West Indies. But they won't mention that those commodities were critical in building up an economy of capitalism built on the labor of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. They will tell you that by the early 20th century, the banks were involved in financing railroads and sugar plantations in Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and Trinidad, but they won't tell you that exploited free Black labor was a necessary basis for their profits. They will tell you that they were present during the long process of Caribbean decolonization and the movement towards Caribbean independence, but they won't tell you that they refused to employ Black tellers and Black clerks, only porters and servants, and that their directors remained white. And they won't tell you that when Black power tried to change the racial order of banking in the Caribbean, that was the moment they washed their hands of the Caribbean, deeming the region too much of a risk for their profits. Nor will they tell you the history of Caribbean resistance to Canadian banking through the indigenization and localization of Canadian banks, through strikes and bank runs, through street protests and militant attacks, and through the attempt to organize other types of credit and banking institutions based, as Carolyn Shanaz Hossein up at York has documented, on African and Indian economic tradition and practice. They also won't tell you that George Lamming's technique of separation, that is, of divide and rule, was critical to their history in the Caribbean. It is better for Canadian bankers and indeed Canadian diplomats for the Caribbean to remain a fragmented archipelago, divided by colonial languages and small island nationalism, than to have the region sharing an economy, a currency, a banking system. Better Cuba is isolated from Jamaica and Haiti, and Barbados from Martinique and Guadeloupe, than the political and economic borders between them dissolved. It is better to have the Royal Bank of Canada or the Bank of Nova Scotia or Santander or BNP reap their spoils from the Caribbean than the Caribbean share its own wealth. The technique of separation remains, and so too does Lamming's loneliness. Though today, it is not the loneliness of the West Indian migrant in Canada, but it is the loneliness of Haiti within Canada's foreign policy, as the government of Black-faced unfortunate son Justin Trudeau seeks to use CARICOM to separate Haiti from the Caribbean with the aim of extending Canada's corporate and financial reach into the West Indies. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but that corporate and financial reach is also the reach of white supremacy. It should be the task of all good Canadians to use the archive of Caribbean writing to understand the history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean, and to realize that the history of Caribbean labor and resources has been crucial to Canada's history. Thank you.
Our next speaker of the evening/afternoon, depending on where you are, is Tamanisha J. John. She is an assistant professor of international political economy at Clark Atlanta University, where she teaches courses on international political economy, politics, and global issues. She holds a PhD in international relations from Florida International University, holds an MA in Latin American and Caribbean Studies from Florida International University as well. And her research interests include Caribbean development, economic imperialism, financial exclusion, and Canadian overseas banking. Welcome, Tamanisha.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for having me as well. As people are talking, I always try to erase what they say from any of my notes or talking points, just so that it won't be as repetitive. And I guess tonight I will be talking about the recent meeting that just happened in Haiti, but also structural adjustment and just Canada's role in the Caribbean more generally, as everyone else has. And so for people who may not know, last week from February 15th to 17th, there was the 44th Heads of Government CARICOM meeting in the Bahamas to talk about CARICOM's single market economy, food security, and climate change, with the goals of coming up with collaborative regional solutions to address all of these issues. However, given that the special invited guest was Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, the issue of military intervention in Haiti was also on the agenda. This trend towards intervention as proposed by Canada received support from governments like Jamaica's Andrew Holness and Haiti's incumbent and illegitimate President Ariel Henry, both prior to the CARICOM meeting and during it. But this stance of intervention in Haiti and the Caribbean is not without opposition. We do have people like Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, who's made it clear that he would not be supporting any military intervention into Haiti, because Haitians would rightly view that intervention by external states and actors propping up this illegitimate president as an affront to their political, social, economic, and ecological self-determinations there. Nonetheless, even though there was some opposition, Prime Minister Trudeau still announced at this meeting that Canada would be sending 2 warships to Haiti to quote unquote fight urban gangs and gather intelligence. But of course, Canada's surveillance of Haiti was already an issue prior to this meeting last week, because Canada has had military grade jets flying over the island constantly to engage in surveillance gathering. The addition of Canadian warships are to monitor Haiti's coastal waters, but more importantly, to potentially see which kinds of materials are coming in and out of Haiti, and also to prevent Haitians from trying to leave the island. And so it's also serving as an extra added restrictive immigration measure. Now, of course, Trudeau shrouded Canada's militarism and intervention in this language of quote unquote helping the Haitian people, which is not unusual for Canadian politicians to do. From the 1960s to the 1980s, anti-communism, along with surveillance and intervention that comes along with this ideology and political strategy, made Canada one of the biggest givers of foreign aid to the Caribbean region. And although this aid tremendously helped Canadian businesses in the region and increased Canada's own political and military sway there, many people still believe that this aid was to simply help Caribbean development. Canadian aid disbursement often requires the further liberalization of local markets in the Caribbean in a way that favors and strengthens foreign corporations and foreign ownership of capital. And Canadian aid itself is one of the ways that Canada integrates Caribbean states into the liberal capitalist economic order to facilitate the various kinds of economic imperialisms and exploitation that it is engaged in the region. The interpretation of Canada as a friendly giver of aid and debtor to the region since the 1960s has allowed Canada and Canadian financiers to lead IMF and World Bank groups, which ensure that states in the region are adhering to strict debt clearing measures and other structural adjustment measures and conditionalities. And also Canadian aid and its seeing as a leader in these types of international organizations and international financial organizations has also allowed it to justify its own militarism in the Caribbean, cloaked in, again, this language of humanitarianism, even though they are simply protecting Canadian investments in the region. In the 1970s, Canada spied on Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Grenada, using Jamaica to test its deployment capabilities and its military technologies in the region. And so Canada's history of anti-communism aid in the Caribbean also informs and cements its early security collaboration with states like Jamaica, who today host Canada's Operation Support Hub, that they proclaim to not be a military base, even though by all standards, it's just housing military equipment and has the ability to house a lot of Canadian soldiers there. The Canadian International Development Agency in 1982 singled out Cuban revolutionary activity as the main threat to political and economic stability in the Caribbean region, and implied that development aid from Canada would stave off Cuban interference in states. Even though they were outwardly cordial with governments like Grenada, they did view that country with suspicion because of what it feared would be Cuban internationalism. And so when the PRG project was decimated in 1983, Canada's commitment to aid and intervention in the Caribbean region also increased. And of course, Canada does sustain interest in mining, banking, insurance, and other kinds of resource extraction in the Caribbean. And that also helps to buttress its militarism and intervention in a lot of these states that we're talking about. Dr. Edmonds mentioned before me that Canada helped to plan and facilitate the coup in 2004. And one of the reasons why Canada was there even prior to the United States is because today Canada is one of the biggest key donors to the security sector in Haiti, contributing not just to policing, but also prisons and guarding the border or guarding immigration to some respect. And when we look at the Caribbean region as a whole, there was a lot of focus tonight on the British-speaking Caribbean, but Haiti is the state most subjected to interventions by Canada's military and policing forces, wherein since 1951, 55% of all Canadian military operations in the Caribbean have occurred in Haiti. And so it is not surprising that it was, Canada who first in October 2022 made the call for military intervention in Haiti. And I will say that you have this humanitarian narrative that Canada is contributing to worldwide peace, not just in the Caribbean, but throughout the world. However, that is also false. Canada spends the majority of its funds when it's talking about humanitarianism or peacekeeping abroad in investing in military planes, ships, and equipment. And so it is not going around helping states in crisis. A lot of Canada's peacekeeping contributions have actually decreased since the 1990s. And Canada has had an almost exclusive focus on US-led or NATO-led interventions and invasions in other countries for over the past almost 3 decades. One thing that I do think that we should talk about more is how international organizations like the UN, as well as international financial organizations like the IMF and World Bank, legitimize Canadian exploitation and militarism in the Caribbean. And I will just end here.
John wants to know whether our panelists can frame this, I think this being the discussion more generally, and the unionist view from Canada to the Caribbean in the context of US imperialism and the Monroe Doctrine. And John wants to know how does all this fit in with Canada as a junior partner to the US? So maybe I'll put this first to one of our speakers from the US. Peter, do you have any thoughts on that? Canada as a junior partner?
I say 2 things. First of all, I think Canada as a nation has to really come to grips with, I think, 2 psychic moments that have kind of created an ideology of white supremacy that links it with the United States and finds a kind of convergence through expansion. And those 2 psychic moments are, first of all, the history of Western European immigration to Canada and the decimation of indigenous peoples, and which we're still now finding the bodies as a result of that, as we all know. And then the second one is the history of Eastern European immigration after World War II. And we're seeing this through people like Chrystia Friedland and this Bandera cat, where we have to really come to grips with the fact that the people who came from Eastern Europe after World War II were anti-communists, in some cases Nazis, often fascists. What does that mean now for Canadian foreign policy when those 2 long histories of 300 or 400 or 500 years of white supremacist immigration practice is now determining Canadian foreign policy? So that's the first thing. The second thing we have to understand when we're talking about Canadian finance in the Caribbean in relationship to US foreign policy in the Caribbean, Canadian bankers were slick. The Royal Bank of Canada was in many cases a larger presence in places like Haiti and definitely Cuba than Wall Street institutions. And so that while Canada wasn't actively involved through sending troops during the era of dollar diplomacy in the 1910s and 1920s, Canadian bankers actively benefited from the presence of US military in the region. And so Canadian bankers, as the official historian of the Royal Bank of Canada will tell you, acted as surrogate US bankers in the Caribbean. They were the ones who were establishing branches in the Caribbean before US bankers were permitted by the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. They were involved in financing US trade. And in some cases, again, with the Royal Bank of Canada, Chicago investors owned a huge stock of the bank from I think about 1902. So that we have to understand racially and financially, there's a convergence of interest that is supported by US military presence.
Thank you, Peter. Tamanisha.
Yes, I also want to add that I think that using convergence is a lot better than saying junior partner or US lackey or US lapdog. Because oftentimes I find that when people talk about Canada as being sort of, a US lapdog or just following US interests, they ignore things like the fact that Canada didn't join the OAS early on because it didn't want to be perceived as a US lapdog so that it could easily exploit countries who didn't associate it with the US. It also is the reason why the Canadian left, historically and to some extent presently, have been unable to address why Canada acts the way that it does in the Caribbean region. And I think that when you say Canada is simply a junior partner, you're by default making Canada, again, seem a lot friendlier than the US, even though exploitation is exploitation, right? And so there are many instances where Canadian policies disregarded the US or didn't align with the US precisely so that they could reach their own exploitative aims in the Caribbean and just also in other states and countries. So I think it's important to get away from this narrative of junior partner that doesn't allow for a critical analysis of Canada.
Are there any panelists who have any thoughts on Canada's power in CARICOM? Do we have power? And if so, how did we amass it? Any thoughts on that? Anything you'd like to share?
So I will say that even though CARICOM is a regional organization in the Caribbean, if we take something like security, for instance, I think almost half or maybe even over half of CARICOM's security budget is externally funded. And the top contributors to that funding of security are US, Canada, and Europe in that order. So I'm assuming when they say Europe, it's probably like Britain and France or whoever former colonizers were in some of the states that have independence. And so when you have a regional mandate that is externally funded or has a large part of your regional mandate being externally funded, I think that those external funds are able to buy you influence. Because it is not just the case that they are giving you money so that you can run the organization how you want, but when Canada specifically gives money for security funding to CARICOM, it is for policing, borders, and prisons. And so just by those three mandates, I'm not surprised that they're trying to collect or intercept anything that may be coming through coastal waters. And so when people ask about why there is influence, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they fund a lot of these initiatives in the Caribbean. A lot of security initiatives in the Caribbean just in general are externally funded. They are not internally funded by states. And without that external funding, a lot of the I think like regional policing meetings and things that happen just wouldn't occur, because outside of even looking at, things from a military perspective, there are regional police unions that meet up in the Caribbean. And oftentimes there's a lot of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police or whatever it is in those meetings. And it's like, why are you guys there for a regional thing in the Caribbean if you're, so far away in some respect? And so I think they have power because they give a lot of the funding and they are dictating a lot of what is securitized in the region.
Thank you, Tamanisha.
I would only add that I think to understand Canada in the Caribbean, and in part one has to kind of telescope outward and look at Canada in the world and look at Canada in terms of a series of alliances that it has with other nations, especially the United States. And I think, I don't know if we know what does it mean for Canada to be part of the Five Eyes alliance with domestic espionage, and then what does it mean for Canada to be a part of NATO, and how does that impact Canadian foreign policy in the Caribbean.
One person sent in a question in advance asking about the connections between the colonization of Turtle Island and the Caribbean, and what this sort of says about Canada's colonial imagination, colonial ideology. We also have someone in the chat who wants to know, and it seems related, whether there are any similarities between Canada and Australia, and the treatment of Aboriginal people there. So I'm not sure if there's anyone, do any of our panelists want to speak to either of those questions?
I will say this, since I do have an article coming out, and it's about militarism, and in it I say that people need to critique Anglo-Spiric settler states like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand just as much. And I would say that there are certainly parallels in these states' activities abroad, but to say the exact extent, I don't know what they are. I remember a while back, I was looking at Kiribati and how Australia uses drones to stop or intercept those people from being able to migrate to Australia, even though it is on these Pacific islands, exploiting them as well. So I assume that there would be parallels in that respect, but I don't think that there are enough people investigating a lot of these other states that are just as imperialistic simply because the United States exists. And I think that that is a serious misstep or a serious oversight, because when we talk about organizations like NATO, or when we talk about security collaborations between the US, Europe, Canada, and all of these other states, what we're really talking about is the fact that there's a European and a broader or more general Anglo-Spiric alliance that exists, and it continues to exploit states in the present. And if we don't have enough people researching or talking about the exploitations that who they consider the small actors are engaged in, a lot of the different kinds of exploitations and how we can build solidarity between struggles get lost. And so I think it is important to do deeper investigations of those, but I cannot say that I do a deep investigation of Australia.
Can I think the questions are, the comparative questions are extremely important. And I'm not the person who could respond to the question, but I also think it's important for this panel today to refocus a little bit on Canada and the Caribbean per se, because I think one of the things that I'm hearing from the panelists, and that I'm learning a lot from the panelists, is that the levels of research that still need to be done on this relationship I mean, there's so much work to be done. And I know, I've done some research into the history of Canadian banking in the Caribbean, and one of the difficulties that I had, and I don't know if Paula also had this difficulty writing Dominion over Pine and Pawn, is that you can't get access to the archives of the Royal Bank of Canada, or the Bank of Nova Scotia, or the Bank of Montreal, or the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Now, these are institutions that the Canadian public sees as basically public institutions, even though they're private with these federal charters, but they don't allow you access to anything. The history of all of the things that we are asking, going back 200 years, is in those archives. The answers are there. The answers are in the documentation. I think a scholar called Neil Quigley once upon a time got access to the Bank of Nova Scotia board minutes, but no one has been in there since then. And this is a problem to me. And I think that there should be some way that we're advocating to get those archives open. Because if we're looking at the history of banking, we're also looking at the history of sugar. We're looking at the history of shipping. We're looking at the history of lumber. We're looking at the history of migration. We're looking at the history of diplomacy. But we also have to remember, we're not just looking at the history of banking. We need to talk about Canadian insurance firms in the Caribbean. As people pointed out, in the chat, we have to talk about the history of Canadian mining companies in the Caribbean, in South America and Africa. And these are some of the largest mining companies in the world. And as people like Yves Engler and others are doing, we have to look at the history of the Canadian arms trade at this point, and the work that they've been doing. And I think, again, going back to the comment that Canada is the peaceful brother or whatever, but they're also, Canada's a major exporter of arms. And I think that it benefits Canada to promote military occupation in Haiti, because they get to send Canadian troop carriers and things to Haiti. And so there's a political and financial and manufacturing loop that occurs here. But it becomes impossible to do that research without access to archives, or without a kind of team of students and professors who are really to kind of collectively work to try to unearth that material through trade publications, and through published documents that might be available through the NATO archive, or the OAS archive, or the IMF archive, or the Inter-American Development Bank archive, or the MINISTA archives, or the United Nations archives.
Thank you, Peter. We have a couple of questions about banks. I'm going to just read all of them out. Tamara wants to know, are there any lawsuits against banks for exploitation, restitution for slavery, etc.? Someone wanted to know about Canada's role in writing banking legislation after independence, and Canada's relationship to the Caribbean Development Bank, and whether and what their role was in establishing that. Is there anyone who'd like to speak to any of those questions, maybe briefly, as we're coming to the end of our time together?
Well, I will say, and this is what my dissertation focused on, was about how Canada had a hand in writing a lot of the banking legislation and finance laws in Caribbean states after their independence, precisely because they already had established dominance in a lot of these English-speaking Caribbean states prior to them receiving independence. And a lot of the legislation that they helped Caribbean states write was to somewhat not have any harmful or negative sorts of legislation towards themselves, especially when it came to expatriating or repatriating profits abroad, or heavily investing in foreign industries. And so Canadian banks have a big hand in sort of setting up a lot of the tourist industries and tourism sectors in the Caribbean region today that we associate with exploitation, or facilitating negative service economies. And I think that, again, not a lot of people speak about this or talk about it, precisely because, as Dr. Hudson pointed out, a lot of these documents are unavailable. So I also had trouble when I'm doing my dissertation, and even now when I'm trying to do research, accessing bank records or bank information prior to 1990 or something. They close it off at that point. But the bankers themselves, as they were seen as the dominant banking entities in the Caribbean region, they helped states write a lot of those legislation. And they wrote it in a way that they could be very competitive over even the creation of local banks in the Caribbean. And so if we look at the Eastern Caribbean region, for instance, you have a lot of those countries which set up or develop their own sort of like state banks or local banks. And their state and local banks had to pay higher interest and higher taxes than even these foreign banks that had all of this capital, precisely because Canadian bankers helped to legislate a lot of the banking laws in their countries. So
I think obviously the CARICOM Reparations Committee is looking towards England in terms of trying to get restitution for slavery. I don't know. I don't think they're looking north to Montreal and Toronto to do something similar. I don't think that's on the agenda at all. I would also say that the question of reparations, in my mind, shouldn't simply be reparations for slavery. We also have to remember that the Royal Bank of Canada was the banker to Machado in Cuba. It was the banker to Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and it was the banker to both Duvaliers. We don't know how much money was squirreled out of the country out of the Dominican Republic, out of Port-au-Prince, and out of Havana to Montreal when those dictatorships ended. No one knows. And so when we talk about reparations, we also might want to talk about reparations for odious debts and the violence of dictatorship in the 20th century, and linking that to Canadian banks.
Thank you so much, Peter. On a related note, Kurt wants to know about what are some of the mass-based formations across the Caribbean that represent the voice of grassroots opposition to Canada's policies in the region. Do those exist? The question has sort of been answered a little bit. And what insights can we learn from them? Is there any more that panelists can offer our audience around the resistance that does or does not exist to Canada's policies in the region?
I would just very quickly say that I think other people on the panel could speak about contemporary formations, but we also have to remember that the movement of Black power across the Caribbean was in part a movement against Canadian imperial finance in the region. And so we can look to that kind of history as well as to more contemporary formations to develop a critique.